All right, 5.6, number 2. We're being given an enthymeme here, which means we have an argument that's missing either a premise or a conclusion, and we have to figure out what that missing premise is and then put the argument into standard form and determine whether or not it's valid or invalid. So the tricky thing about enthymemes is they can set off a feeling of panic, right? Because there's some information that we know is relevant, actually critical to the argument, but we're not being told what it is. It's missing. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is figure out what's missing. Is it a premise that's missing, or is it a conclusion that's missing? The easiest way to go about doing that is to look for indicator words. If you see a word like because, that tells you that whatever follows that word because is going to be a premise, and whatever came before because was the conclusion. Okay? Or if you see a word like hence, or thus, or therefore, or consequently, those signal to you, okay, what's coming next is the conclusion. That means that what came before must be a premise. All right? So if you have one of those indicator words, life's a lot easier. In this argument, number 11, we don't have them. But we do have a word that's kind of interesting. The word and. When you see a word like and it's taking two sentences and joining them together, kind of adding them together, that word and is telling you that these two sentences are doing the same thing. They're serving the same function, okay? When you have a word like consequently or because, you're going to have two sentences that aren't doing the same thing, right? The sentence that follows consequently is serving as a conclusion, and what came before that sentence is serving as a premise. But because arguments only have one conclusion, whenever you see two sentences joined with and, or a word like additionally or furthermore, what that's telling you is these two sentences are doing the same thing, and therefore they have to both be premises, okay? So we know right away that in this particular enthymeme, we're missing the conclusion, okay? But it's not time to panic, because we're just going to go step by step and see if we can figure out what that missing conclusion is. The easiest way to go about doing that is to take each one of these sentences and translate them into standard form. Now, when I look at this first sentence, I see wherever, and that's an immediate sort of bell ringing in my head. Anytime I see wherever, anytime I see whenever, those are telling me something about all. If it's whenever, it's telling me about all times. If it's wherever, it's telling me about all places. All places what? All places that water exists are places human life can be sustained. All right, so there's my first sentence. So now I got to figure out this second sentence. Water exists on the moon. Water exists on the moon. Is that telling me some water exists on some moons? Is that telling me that some moons have water? Or is that telling me all places identical to the moon are places water exists? That's one possibility. All places water exists are places identical to the moon. Every semester I get students who choose both of these, or I get one student chooses one, another student chooses another. So think for a minute about which one of those sentences that I've just given you here, these two right here, which one of those accurately translates water exists on the moon? And hopefully you'll see, well, it's got to be number one, because it's not true that all places water exists are places identical to the moon. There's water on Earth too, okay? So the correct translation for all places water exists, all places identical to the moon are places water exists. All right, so now we have our two premises. So we're looking for a conclusion here. Now the easiest way to go about this is to think about a couple of things. First, remember these categorical syllogisms, they have two terms that appear exactly 2 times each. Not 3, not 1, 2 times each, okay? Now one of these terms will have already appeared twice, the middle term, okay? So places water exists, right here, and right here. There's your middle term, okay? So we know that that's not going to be a term in the conclusion. We know instead that this term, places human life can be sustained, is only appearing once so far, so it's going to be in the conclusion, okay? The other term that's going to be in the conclusion is this one, all places identical to the moon. Oops, I just got rid of my other, are places water exists. So here's my other term. But I don't know where in the conclusion they appear, because I don't know what the major and minor term of the argument is. So maybe what I would do, just to make things really easy on myself, is to create a couple of possibilities with the subject and predicate terms in different places, and then see which one seems to follow from the premises, okay? So, using my rule for categorical syllogisms, I know that if I have two premises that are universal, that for the first four rules, the conclusion also has to be universal, okay? We can't go from two universal premises to a particular conclusion from the Boolean standpoint, because that would be an existential fallacy. I also know by rule number 3 that I can't have two negative premises, and I don't. And I know from rule 4 that if I have a negative premise, I have to have a negative conclusion. But I don't have a negative premise here. I have affirmative premises. That means I have to have an affirmative conclusion. And there's only one affirmative universal proposition, and that's all. So let's try this out. So all places human life can be sustained are places identical to the moon. That's one possibility. And the other is all places human life can be sustained are places. Oops, I did that wrong. All places identical to the moon. Oh boy, see, this is what happens when you do it in real time. All places identical to the moon are places human life can be sustained. All right, which one of those do you think it is? It has to be one or the other. Okay, if it's true that all places that water exist are places human life can be sustained, and it's true that all places identical to the moon are places water exist, would that mean that all places human life can be sustained are places identical to the moon? No. There's lots of other places human life can be sustained. For example, Earth. I mean, there's not lots. All right. So here we have our conclusion that seems to follow with logical necessity from these two premises, okay? Now what we want to do is we want to make sure that our major and minor terms appear in the major and minor premise, okay? Because if we're going to do, look at the form of the argument to determine whether or not it's valid, we got to make sure our premise is in the right place. All right, so here is our minor term. Okay, and it should appear here in the second premise, and look at that, it does. And here's our major term, and it should appear up here in the first premise, and look at that, it does. So if we wanted to use the form of an argument to determine whether or not this guy is valid or invalid, we just determine its form, okay? And this happens to be an AAA in figure 1. Right, because we can see our middle terms have a line connecting them, go sloping downward from left to right. Okay, so if I look at page 267, I'm going to see, yep, that's what's called a Barbara AA, figure 1. Yes, that is a valid argument. So that might be one way we could prove it valid. The other way we could do is just apply the rules. We know that the middle term has to be distributed at least once, and here in yellow is my middle term, and all A claims distribute their subject terms, and so it distributes the middle term right here in this first premise. The second rule says if there's a term distributed in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in a premise. And look here, our subject term, the minor term in the conclusion, places identical to the moon, is distributed because the conclusion is an A claim. It's also distributed in an A claim here in the second premise. So past first two rules, third and fourth rules don't even apply because those deal with negative statements, and we don't have any negative statements here. And the fifth rule doesn't apply either because we have a universal conclusion, all right? So that might be another way we come at this to prove it valid. It passes all the rules, and we know the form of it, and we see it on page 267. It's good to go. We could do a Venn diagram, but I don't have my tablet handy, so I'm not going to do that. All right? So again, the step by step. Begin by looking for those indicator words. Then start translating those different statements into standard form. That's going to make it so much easier for you to work with. Then look to see what the terms are that you're dealing with. Does it look like you can identify the two terms that haven't been used 2 times each? Because those will be the terms that are either going to be in a premise or a conclusion. All right,